It is time to go. Welcome back. I hope that you have found the ability to yield to the Lord and rest in His strength every day this week. We certainly need it. I am feeling it today. Change of weather, I don't know. Allergies, I don't know. But man, I feel like I got an extra 3 inches between my eyes and the back of my head right now pressing. Just feels like a little pressure there. So hopefully I'll be able to concentrate as we go through. Let's look to the Lord and seek His strength as we always need it. Father God, it is your word. It is your truth. It is your work that you have done in and through your people. And we desire to be your people, walking in your way. We thank you that you have created that desire in us by drawing us to yourself graciously through the Holy Spirit's work in the Word to reveal to us Christ, so that our hearts were wooed to respond in faith and to believe that we might not only know Him, but that we might follow Him. And I pray that as we study your word today, faithful service of those who have followed you in the past, we might look even beyond their great examples to their great God, who is our God, in whom we trust, and in whose name we pray today. Amen. Daniel chapter 3, right on the heels, if you recall, of the promotion of God's people as a result of the Lord revealing to Nebuchadnezzar the history of the future, as it were, the plan an outline of the plan of his work in the world during the times of the Gentiles. We see at the end of chapter 2 that Daniel made request to the king, and he appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the administration of the province of Babylon while Daniel was at the king's court. And this is the transition verse into chapter 3. So would you read with me? Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold, the height of which was 60 cubits, and its width 6 cubits. And he set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king sent word to assemble the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the rulers of the provinces, to come to a dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. Then the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the rulers of the provinces, you're going to hear that a few times, by the way, were assembled for the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up, and they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then the herald loudly proclaimed, "To you the command is given, O peoples, nations, and men of every language, that at the moment you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the lyre, the trigon, the psaltery, the bagpipe, and all kinds of music, that you are to fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king has set up. But whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into the midst of a furnace of blazing fire." Therefore, at that time, when all the peoples heard the sound of the horn, the flute, the lyre, the trigon, the psaltery, the bagpipe, and all kinds of music, all the peoples, nations, and men of every language fell down and worshiped the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. For this reason, at that time, certain Chaldeans came forward and brought charges against the Jews. They responded and said to Nebuchadnezzar the king, "O king, live forever. You yourself, O king, have made a decree that every man who hears the sound of the horn, the flute, the lyre, the trigon, the psaltery, the bagpipe, and all kinds of music is to fall down and worship the golden image. But whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast in the midst of a furnace of blazing fire. There are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the administration of the province of Babylon, namely Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have disregarded you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image which you set up." We're going to stop and go that far today and look at the events that were laid before these three young Hebrew men, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And we have referenced this section, looking forward to it already, because it's difficult to think about the early chapters of Daniel without looking forward to it. But now we're going to go through it with some degree of care. And I'd like to give you some background. This is a good place at which to enter into some of the discussion that came out of especially out of the late 19th century, that attacked Daniel as a biblical revelatory work. And it did so on the basis of questioning the date of Daniel. Daniel writes as if he is in the 6th century BC, which he is, living at a time when Nebuchadnezzar has conquered Babylon. But one of the ways in which the critics have challenged the book of Daniel as not being a piece of true revelation, and especially in an age in the late 19th century, early 20th century, when questions about the believability of actual revelation, true supernatural events and things like that was being highly questioned, rationalists attacked the book of Daniel and said no. Because there's too much in the prophecies of Daniel that is too accurate and too obvious that it can't be, thinking of naturalism, it can't be true revelation. Therefore, the only other explanation is you had to have recorded these things after they happened, right? So if you rule out the obvious, God predicted what would happen. God is sovereign, and it happened the way he said. Once you rule that out, you don't have a lot of options. And the only other option is you have to push the dating of the record forward to say, no, this is normal, natural, human stuff. They looked back and recorded what happened. So in Daniel 3, 1 through 5, we see set up a number of things that critics of the book of Daniel point to that question the date. And they suggest that instead of being a 6th century BC work, it's actually more than 400 years newer than that. It was 400 years later. It's actually a 2nd century BC work, okay? So it's after Alexander, and the beginning of Rome, right? So it's at least at the beginning of Rome in the 2nd century BC. So what I'd like to do to start with is look at these first 5 verses and think about critics' attacks on the historicity of Daniel, and from the perspective of both a servant of the Lord who studies his word and a servant of the Lord who studies history. I'd like to look at this from a historian's perspective a little bit, okay? So concerning the image itself, first of all, critics have pointed out and challenged the fact of the historicity of the story due to the supposed quantity of gold that would be necessary to make a statue this size, right? So the scripture says Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold. Its height was 60 cubits, all right? So I'm not great at math, but I'll tell you that a cubit typically is the standard cubit. Eventually, it varies because it's the point between your elbow and the tip of your finger. So it kind of depends on the person, right? But it was usually standardized in kingdoms based on the king or some record of a previous king that said it. And usually it's kind of slushed into 18 inches, all right? So give or take, about 18 inches. 60 cubits, therefore, is obviously 18 inches is 1.5 feet. So 60 cubits would be like 90 feet tall. 9 stories, right? 9-story building. Think about that, right? And it says that it was width, its width was 6 cubits. That's a strange proportion, right? 60 cubits tall, 6 cubits. It's like really tall and narrow, right? But we'll just start with the material itself. How much gold would it take to do that, right? And how would you form gold that was like that? Well, The supposed quantity of gold is one of the critics' expression. I call this criticism a fabricated concern from a historian's perspective. This sounds great to somebody who doesn't think about the ancient world very much and doesn't read ancient literature very much, and it can sound like, yeah, that can't be right. Who could build a statue of solid gold? Actually, it's not necessary. The Old Testament regularly refers to items clearly described as having been overlaid with or plated with gold as being of gold. That's the normal process of the ancient world, and everyone who would have read this in the time period would have understood that. There's only the very, very smallest objects were made of pure gold. Everybody knows and describes and is not hiding and not pretending that you start with a wood or a stone under feature, which is carved to reflect what you want, and then you hammer onto it plating of gold in order to make it gold.
Is that possibly true of the golden calf?
It is entirely possible that the golden calf was the same. Yes.
Yeah. Yes.
We have no dimensions of what that calf was.
No, we don't. And in that
case, it's possible that it was solid, and especially because he was trying to make the argument that it popped out of the fire, which would suggest that it maybe wasn't, but it's possible that it was. Yeah. They could shape gold. Gold is soft and melted and then allowed to harden slowly. You can shape gold into things, but it's much easier to shape an underlying material like wood or stone and then plate it than it is to shape the gold itself. So I call this a fabricated argument. We could look at examples, but you've already mentioned a couple of them, so I won't. Passages here you might want to look at include Exodus 39, 38, Exodus 37. You might compare that with Exodus 37, verses 25 and 26, and Isaiah 40, verse 19. But the Old Testament is replete, and so are ancient literatures from other sources, is just replete with examples of this kind of plating. Yes.
I think it's Solomon's Temple.
I didn't want to bring it up one more time. I'm glad you did, but I was going to feel guilty if I brought up John's study of Solomon's Temple one more time, but I probably will bring it up again. But over and over again, things are described as gold, which are clearly the building of it is designed to have been hammered onto things. So the process was so common in the ancient Near East that it really would have required no elaboration or explanation in Daniel chapter 3 to say that he made this image of gold. Thanks for playing Try Again. How about the dimensions? Let's go back to these dimensions. They seem very odd, right? Basically 1 to 10. It's really narrow, really tall, okay? So is this realistic? Is it mythic? Some critics have challenged the accuracy of the story due to these dimensions. Not only do they seem to be awkwardly top-heavy, tall and skinny, but they also don't seem to fit the dimensions of the human body, right? That seems a little weird with regard to that. There are three. This is a reasonable question to ask. I mean, those dimensions are odd. I mean, you look at it and you think, wow. Of course, remember, Nebuchadnezzar is trying very hard to make something stand out. Fair? This would really stand out. Have you seen the Washington Monument? I'm always struck. Somebody told me the other day, and it really struck me. It looks nothing like Washington. But, sorry, that was really poor. It stands out as an obelisk because it's oddly dimensioned, right? And it's intended that way. It's supposed to do that, right? But the critics are correct in that this does seem to be unusual. So I'm going to give you three responses that I think are reasonable to think about this. First of all, Babylon, when you study other architectural and statuary work of Babylon, Babylon was known for its intentionally grotesque representations, especially of their deities. And this is to be a deity, right? They're going to fall down and worship the image. So the statue may have been disproportionate on purpose to be weird looking, right? And we do this all the time. I didn't take the time to Google any images, but in graphic art, we do this all the time in the modern world, where we make something look disproportionately weird in order to stand out and make a statement. Graphic novels do this a lot. Anime does this all the time. Okay, this is just it's not an uncommon human characteristic artistically to do this for a purpose, and it makes sense if Nebuchadnezzar had chosen to do that. Secondly, the height may have and probably did include a fairly high pedestal upon which the statue rested. Such a platform, for example, has been found in the archaeology of Babylon. It was found in the region of Babylon. It was made of brick. It measured around 20 feet tall, 45 feet square. And it could be that the dimensions include a platform in the height, but not in the width. If that makes sense. Okay? So the statue's width is described correct, specifically, but then the overall height, including a platform, which makes sense also because the gods did not touch the earth typically in the ancient Near East. They always were put on some form of dais or platform. Even in their temples, even in ancient Near Eastern temples, there were raised, stepped areas. Going all the way back, honestly, to, although it's not directly connected, but the idea of the stepped temples, which is probably a ziggurat, which is probably what the Tower of Babel was, and which we find examples of all over the world, including in Middle and South America, right? So that form of structure says when you have worship, you build it on a terrace of some sort of platform, and it's very likely that that would have been true as well, and this would have been included in the height, not necessarily in the width. So it could be that the statue itself was not as grossly disproportionate as it sounds, right? In that sense. Third possibility, yeah, sorry.
So let's see.
Give me a good history of war.
We were on our way to Florida, and we spent the night in Birmingham, Alabama, which is the home of Vulcan Steel, and was. And there is a statue of Vulcan, this mythical Vulcan figure.
Mm-hmm.
And they say the statue is 180 feet tall. The pedestal is 130 feet of the 180 feet. The statue itself is 56 feet tall, okay?
Which is impressive.
Which is, that's like 2/3 of of this one. But they say the Vulcan statue is 180 feet tall. Well, actually, it's 56 feet tall.
Right.
And it sits on 130 foot pedestal, so it's.
And nobody is questioning their integrity.
Right? I mean, that's not the issue. And that's an extreme example. There's a lot of platform, right? There wouldn't have to have been as much platform here as what you're saying, which is great. Yeah, that's a good example. When we drove out to see Jathan and Savannah, our oldest son and daughter, the first time a couple of years ago in Wyoming, we passed through the town where Jolly Green Giant, Green Giant Vegetables, their founding plant was, and there's a Jolly Green Giant in town, and it's quite impressive, let me tell you. But it stands on a pedestal too, and that raises its height. Exactly. So third option, or third thing to note here, or not an option, but just a third thing to note about this criticism, although it has more legitimacy in a sense than the first criticism did, which just seems fabricated to me. I mean, it's just, you're just hiding. The first one about the gold, you're just hiding behind the obvious. I don't know what you're going to do there. But the dimensions one, it has some legitimacy, though I think it has reasonable explanations that are not that hard. So the last thing I would say with regard to this is, why would any writer who's trying to pass himself off as a 6th century forgery in the 2nd century BC, why would he use such dimensions if they weren't true? I mean, why? If you're trying to pass off a forgery, you try to make it believable. I mean, it doesn't make sense, So anyway, it just the criticisms melt quickly. Yes.
I don't know if you were gonna
I got one more, go ahead.
go into, well, one thing, I don't know why this never occurred to me, that it doesn't actually say what the image was.
Right?
I mean, we make the assumption that it's a, I guess, a replica of Nebuchadnezzar himself, or,
Or a god.
well, what would be a possible god that they would, make an image of? I'm not familiar with.
So
the god.
warrior gods.
Would have been common. So the difference between Nebuchadnezzar and a warrior god would not be much, in terms of imagery. And that's usually, as you see here, that's usually, and on the slide before, a different one that I had, that's a common assumption. And especially, this was related to what I'd said last time when we finished chapter 2, that the connection both in timing, which I will look at in a minute, and in terms of context with regard to chapter 2, it really leans, and the fact that these types of images of both kingly or deity forms looking like a Babylonian, Neo-Babylonian warrior are so common in relief and statuary. It's very probable, though we don't know. We don't know what the image was. Yeah. But it's very probable it was. The last criticism, actually, about this is its location. So in order to challenge the historicity of the book, they suggest, the critics suggest that the plain of Dura has not been located in Babylonian, other Babylonian literature or inscriptions, and they don't know of anything that's a plain of Dura. Right? They're not sure where that would be. So maybe somebody who didn't know the area wrote this 400 years later and described it as made up a place, the plain of Dura, kind of a thing. This, because it has not been definitively located, has been an argument by critics. I remind you at this point, first of all, and then I'll go into a little more detailed, but I remind you that arguments from silence, which we often note, are always weak. Right? So when you make an argument based on you don't have any evidence, that's a weak argument, right? Because all you know is you don't have the evidence. You don't know whether you're implying that there isn't evidence. But that you don't know that because you don't know what you don't know. You never know what you don't know, right? So that it's always a weak, it might be useful, and frankly, sometimes we use them too, right? So the arguments from silence are not useless, but they are weak inherently. So, for example, I often love to point to the fact that in the 17th century and into the early 18th century, there was a lot of discussion about the so-called Hittites of the Old Testament, because obviously we have no evidence of the Hittites, the critics would say, and the Enlightenment people said, there were Hittites, like there weren't any Hittites, this is apparently just a fabrication. And then the 19th century archaeology happened, and we found out, oh, wait a second, yeah, Hittites are mentioned a lot, all over inscriptions in archaeology. As a matter of fact, now the critics argue that the Bible didn't represent the Hittites as being as important as they were. Oh boy, yes?
See, that's what our whole premises of innocent until proven guilty is based on. If you
Yeah.
can't bring the evidence within a certain amount of time,
Right.
you have to let the individual go.
Yeah, yeah.
You don't know what you don't know, right? You have to. Law is positive. You have to have the evidence, right? So, with that stated, it's not necessarily something that should be ignored. I mean, okay, so where's the plain of Dura? One possible explanation for this is that the plain of Dura did not retain its name as a place name because it was a description that became a place name rather than a place name. So the plain of Dura, the phrase "the plain of Dura" in Aramaic is the plain of the wall. Dura is the wall. Okay, we do know that Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon had significant walls. It would seem that Nebuchadnezzar is saying that he set up his image on the plain of the wall. Now, there are two sets of double walls that surrounded the city of Babylon. It was an impressive defensive fortification and city. The inner set was about a mile long on each side, and it was surrounded, and it surrounded the central part of the city. We'll get to it later, but this is a place that from the time period, and archaeologists would say that you could have driven chariots around this thing. You know what I mean? It was on the walls. I mean, it was a thick, broad set of walls with a dead zone in between. And it was relatively small and in there. But there was also an outer set of walls, several miles in length, that surrounded the eastern half of the city, about a mile to the north and east of the city. So it stretched out over this broad, creating a safe plain on which things could happen publicly, public space kind of a thing. It left this large open area between the two sets of the walls. It was bordered by the Euphrates River on the west. And this vast area would make a perfect place to gather representatives from the provinces in the area of the Empire of Babylon and to build a massive idol for this purpose. So the plane of the wall may indeed have been that space in between those double sets of walls. So it doesn't seem like it's that odd. It would make sense that this is the type of place that the city would have used for such a purpose. Okay. There are also some questions about the language. So we have questions concerning the image itself, and now questions concerning the language in these verses. So in verses 2 and 3, we read descriptions of the people who came, right? In New American Standard, I read it as satraps, prefects, governors, counselors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the rulers of the provinces, right? And we find in other places that these are people who speak different languages. This is a broad empire, right? The words that are used here, and then later, he describes what you're going to listen to, and it describes the instruments as the horn, the flute, the lyre, the trigon, the psaltery, the bagpipe, and all kinds of music, okay? So the words that are used here, some critics call loaner words or words of late derivation. In other words, they don't feel that they have enough evidence that language that Neo-Babylonians would have used, the Aramaic that they would have used these terms. They would have been later terms. So for example, I just use a really random example of the modern world, right? So if you're reading someone in, writing a letter supposedly in the late 18th century, right, in France, and they describe that, Napoleon could be much more effective in governing France. This is right at the end of the 18th century, right? Be much more effective. He's so interested in science if he just had a more effective computer. And you think, you know what? There weren't computers in the late 18th century, right? Why would they use the word computer? Maybe that's not original, right? Okay, so sort of like that. Or maybe an instrument that was not well known, right? Before that, or not, you describe an organ in, Rome or something. It's like, in the 6th century, they didn't have organs, right? That's a product of the Renaissance, right? Okay, so these kinds of things are suggested. So verses 2 and 3 seem to have Persian loanwords. Remember that Babylonia was followed by Medo-Persia and the Persian Empire, right? So it seems to have words for administrative offices that are described using Persian derivation words. Daniel may have written, however, this passage. Does he had to have written this passage, within a year or two of it happening? No, he might have written this later. He serves under Cyrus the Persian, right? Long after the Medo-Persians and the Persians have consolidated their rule. He may have written this passage a good deal later and simply brought the titles of the offices up to date, as it were, by using the then current expressions in order to speak to the people he's writing to. He is probably writing this for the Gentiles who are in the next kingdoms, right? He's thinking, because he's writing in Aramaic. So they would want to understand this. He would want to kind of update that, bring it into the context. So that would make sense, and it would be perfectly okay. However, other scholars have pointed out, Kitchen in particular, a highly regarded Semitic scholar, that means he's an expert in these Oriental languages, okay? And he says that the almost unconscious assumption of critics that Persian words would take time to penetrate into Aramaic, in other words, well after 539 BC when Daniel was dead or gone, that's erroneous, he says. In other words, the influence of Persian words on Aramaic probably occurred well before Persia conquered Babylon. It didn't wait, right? It didn't wait for that to happen. Persia didn't get strong enough to conquer Babylon overnight. It had been growing, the Medo-Persian Empire had been growing as a powerful world influence, and the languages were influencing other places before they conquered them. So I will go back to my computer illustration and tweak it just a little bit. My Japanese is terrible because it's non-existent, okay? But I will tell you this, I know a word in Japanese. Do you know what the word for computer is in Japanese? Komputa. It really is, I'm not kidding. That's really the word. That doesn't, wait a second. Computer is an English language based word. Komputa. And you know what? It was komputa even in the older framework of it before the most modern versions of computers were formed. It didn't wait until the United States defeated Japan in World War II for a word to be developed in Japanese that was an English borrow. Okay? And there's lots of examples of that. There's a reason why Rome conquered Greece, but the language of the Roman Empire was Greek. And they didn't wait until, long after they had conquered Greece to begin to incorporate that. So what Kitchen is saying is in the ancient world, just like in the modern world, interactions between people groups and language groups means that languages are borrowing from each other all the time. So his point is that Daniel very well could have used these terms, yes.
The argument or conclusion that languages as we know, or even in the ancient world, continue to evolve.
They do all.
Languages change all the time, yeah. Sometimes to the great chagrin of language smiths and English grammar people, right? Yeah. Yeah, languages do. Here's one that I've just recently been painfully aware of, and I'm sorry, I'm just a little bit of a stick in the mud about it. It drives me crazy, right? So people students I find in writing and in speech constantly using the concept of you're going to build with a foundation, and conceptually you're going to start here and then build on that foundation to other things, and they say building off of. You don't build off of anything, you build on things. And I'm telling you, I never read that phrase. In the last 5 years, I don't think I've read that phrase twice. Build on, it's always build off. I'm sure that I am a Don Quixote, fighting the impossible, but I will fight that. That drives me crazy. You don't build off things, you build on things. Sorry, go ahead.
The expression used to be, I couldn't care less. Linguists have now accepted, I could care less, because that's what everybody says now. It's the exact opposite, but it means the same thing.
Yeah, exactly, yes.
I could care less. I couldn't care less. Yeah, it's actually means something different, but they used to mean the same thing. That's a great example. All right, so anyway, languages do change all the time. In fact, however, there's one more piece of this, and that is that the Persian words that the critics point to in question, linguistic scholars have identified them as specifically being what they call Old Persian words, which means they're dated by linguistic scholars as having been in use more or less exclusively before 300 BC. Oh, so why would the 2nd century forgery use them? I mean, the whole thing falls apart, okay? This fact pretty much destroys any argument for a 2nd century composition. All right, next one. Oh, sorry, I already had that one. Greek loan words. So the instruments contain some words that seem to be Greek instruments. Okay? The words in question here are 3 describing musical instruments or manners of playing. For example, the word that gets translated bagpipe, I think that it is in the English Standard translated that way too, right? So bagpipe, which feels like, wow, did they know the Scots? But that's because the term bagpipe actually means harmony or a concord of sound. So anything that plays more than one pitch at a time is a bagpipe, and that's what you get with that eerie humming sound of the bagpipes, that you get more than one pitch playing at the same time, can be called that. So it might not actually be the name describing a particular instrument just as a name, but describing the type of sound it makes. But anyway, in any case, according to the critics, these are especially indicative of late composition of the book, since Daniel did not live during the Greek Empire when these types of instruments would have been known. The arguments become more complicated here than some of the others, so I'm just going to summarize by suggesting 2 things. Number one, even critical scholars admit that some of the words appear to be, again, pre-Hellenistic, which is a period in Greek history. It's what we would call in my Greek studies, I would call this Ionic rather than Attic. In other words, it was before Alexander the Great, who conquered the then known world in 330s BC. Okay? So again, that's not 2nd century. So pre-336 BC. Secondly, Greek influence on the development of musical instruments and forms has been demonstrated going back well before Alexander. So the Greeks were influencing, again, cultural influence was happening before they conquer. So there's some assumptions that it just seems like non-historians make these kind of criticisms, right? That there are people who aren't archaeologists, don't realize the way cultures blend, languages change gradually, they evolve constantly. You know, they tend to want to have neat little boxes. All right, here we go. What's the political significance of what's going on? I'm not going to spend a lot of time here because I've kind of talked about it already, but those assembled are all political officers. Whatever their titles were, their administrative roles. Okay? All of them are. So when you list these things, the satraps, I love saying the list, the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the rulers of the provinces, what we find is the Neo-Babylonian Empire was highly sophisticated in its bureaucratic structure. It was highly sophisticated. And it had specifically different types of titles and rulers, and all of them are being gathered together, and this emphasis on all the rulers of the provinces come to this dedication clearly suggests that something of political significance is going on. Secondly, Nebuchadnezzar's rage over non-compliance with worshiping his image doesn't seem to fit his religious worldview. He has apparent comfort with the worship of many, even foreign gods. So, for example, in chapter 3, verse 13, Nebuchadnezzar, in rage and anger, gave orders to bring Shadrach. Okay, he's angry about this. In verse 19, it says that he was so filled with wrath that he ordered something irrational, which we'll get to next time. Make the furnace 7 times hotter. If you really want to make these people suffer, what do? You turn the furnace down. Make them suffer longer, right? You turn it up 7 times hotter. I'm saying turn it up. I'm being silly, right? You make it 7 times hotter. They die quicker and painlessly. He's so angry, he's irrational, right? But that doesn't seem to fit with his attitude about religion. So look at chapter 2, verses 47 and 48. Remember these words? The king answered Daniel and said, "Surely your God is a God of gods." He acknowledges different gods, but yours is special. And this is a foreign God, the God of Israel. He's a Lord of kings. He's a revealer of mysteries. Verse 48, he promoted Daniel, made him ruler over the provinces, chief prefect over the wise men. It's a polytheistic society. Yes?
Those all go together, right?
Oh, it's going to.
I think he was so relieved to hear someone explain his dream that in the moment, wow, this is great, I love your God. I don't know, a week later, wait a minute, what was that dream about?
Yes.
Where is my kingdom going?
Absolutely.
So I think his reaction to the dream maybe after the reality has set in.
So
What
what
I'm doing is creating that tension, right? And saying exactly. So what I'm going to say here is that what Nebuchadnezzar is doing is he is acknowledging other gods, but in keeping with the ancient Near Eastern world, the victor kingdom's gods are the victorious gods over the defeated kingdom's gods. And we acknowledge them as gods, but still you have to submit to our gods. And to submit to our gods is to submit to our rule, us. Yes.
The Babylons, like the Egyptians, view the king as a deity, or is it not quite that level?
Babylonians are not beyond ascribing deified traits to their kings, but they don't typically just rule. They don't rule as gods like the Egyptians did, like the Egyptian pharaohs did. All right, so here's a piece of interesting history. The Babylonian Chronicle, another ancient source related to Babylon that was discovered. The Babylonian Chronicle states that there was an attempted coup in the 10th year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. This would have been 595 BC. Remember, Daniel and his friends went in 605 BC. That's when he started his reign. 595 BC, there was an attempted coup. It lasted for 2 months between December 595 and January 594. During this time, circumstances became so desperate for Nebuchadnezzar in the reign that Nebuchadnezzar was forced to personally lead fighting against the rebels in and around Babylon. He couldn't even trust this to his commanders. He had to go out and lead this himself to defend his reign. This could have been the cause for such an assembly sometime afterward to confirm personal loyalty. This makes sense that this is a loyalty test, right? Interestingly, Jeremiah 51, verse 59, indicates that Zedekiah was summoned to Babylon in his 4th year, the 4th year of Zedekiah. That would have been 594, 593. It doesn't say specifically why he was summoned to Babylon, except there was a question of loyalty. If these events relate to Daniel 3, then he may have been there to bow. And if he was, he apparently did. But Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah didn't. That's interesting, right? So this lines up as a loyalty test. But I want to note that my title for the lesson is God's sovereign rule, Yahweh's sovereign rule over the nations. Religion. Not just over the nations, the kings, but over the religion, right? So this is still a religious thing. This has religious significance. So what's the religious significance of this? Come back next week and I'll tell you. God's grace to you. Thanks for spending time.